pleasure and honor to be standing here on this platform, facing colleagues here, and being invited to deliver the keynote address. Professor Lee, I'm very grateful to you. Dr. Peck, grateful to you as well, and all your team. So on behalf of all of us who've traveled from near and far, may I take the opportunity to thank you all very much for hospitality, please. The danger of looking after us so well is that we'll come back again and again. It is an honor also to be here on the 40th anniversary of KAMES, and I suspect that most of us would like to be here for the 80th anniversary as well. So do prepare for that as well. Professor Lee, Excellencies, it is indeed an honor to be doing this keynote address. I have in the pack, you will see a detailed paper of about 6,500 words to deliver. I'm glad to see there are no clocks in the room, and you are too far away from me to cause any disruption, Hoon. However, given that there is a paucity of time, I will limit my comments to the latter part of my paper, but I'll have to do justice to the background, the context as well. My paper is about power, and it is not a very happy reading, I have to say. I'm by nature a very optimistic person, but as I wrote this paper towards the end, you will see that I'm actually having rather terrible time of looking for optimistic silver lining at the state-level relations in the region. And for that, I'm very sorry, because I think the region, as we've heard from Excellency, has so much to offer to its own people, but also to the rest of the world. So do not take my pessimism as a loss of hope in the region's people and its governments. Far from it. It is a cautionary note, if anything. So first, a word about power in the MENA region. Here, for historical, geopolitical, and also state structural reasons, power has been a fluid commodity. It has been contested, but also it has often been juxtaposed with legitimacy. These two have become opposing forces at so many periods in the history of the region. Attainment of power has often followed a brutal struggle for control of the state, which itself in turn has led to the monopolization of power in the hands of often small elites, and the inevitable further straining of elite interactions with society and social forces. Power, in my definition in terms of its form, access to it, but also its levers, has arguably been shaped by the forces of 6 sets of variables. So when you get rid of all the window dressing, in my view, in the 20th century, there were 6 core drivers of the way in which power took its form, and how its levers were used. The 6 I've identified are as follows. The force of nationalism, which took 4 forms in the region. The Ataturkist, the secular Iranian Reza Shah, Arab nationalist, and Zionist. These forces have in all sorts of ways come about, not only influencing their own societies, but also having a broader impact on the rest of the region. The Arab-Israeli conflict is often looked at as an external variable, but in my view, it has played a fundamental part in shaping internal state and inter-Arab dynamics. All you have to do is look at the way in which Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power to understand the domestic power impact of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that it has gone on, it has continued to affect and shape power relations. Thirdly, oil from the 1970s certainly became a profoundly important variable in inter-regional dynamics, creating for the first time a region of haves and have-nots, widening the division of economic ability across the region, but also creating opportunities for a small number of states to punch, if you like, well above their own weight. Oil became another variable in our understanding of power. Political Islam, Professor Karouki has already mentioned this, While from 79 we began to notice it in a very transparent way, it has been present in the region since the very early of state formation in the 1920s, definitely. But from 79 onwards, we begin to see it in a much more tangible fashion, whether it's in Iran, whether it's Afghanistan, but the way in which these became nodes that spread the message of Islam across the region. Islam and power became almost interchangeable in so much of the region. Fifthly, war. Again, we tend to look at war as an interstate affair, but actually war also has a dramatic impact on power. All you have to do is look at the way in which Saddam Hussein was removed for all his faults, he was still a leader of a sovereign Arab state, and his power was robbed through intervention by external forces, which is my final variable, the sixth variable, in terms of determining power. That actually external forces play a very direct role in this region, in determining how power is balanced. These six drivers exist more or less together and about the same time. We look at them in isolation because of events of the day, but there are layers through which we can look at the way in which states in the region interact with each other, and also the way in which states domestically develop and evolve. For a long period, power appeared to be a constant. Authoritarian Arab regimes appeared to have a firm grip on power and were apparently secure, despite continuing internal and external pressures. This, what I call a sea of authoritarian tranquility, turned into a massive storm in December 2010. And I think all of us in this room remember that. I was having dinner watching Al Jazeera when I heard that President Ben Ali was on his way out of Tunisia. And that for us was the beginning of a dramatic process of change, which has left a continuing mark on the way in which power is negotiated in the region. Regime collapsed in succession in several Arab countries between 2010 and 2013, unhinged several established Arab regimes, and in doing so also unhinged regional partnerships. Those between Syria and Saudi Arabia disappeared. Those between Egypt and GCC during Morsi period were tense. Arab Maghreb Union became more or less dysfunctional, but the uprisings also strengthened some other relationships. For example, those between Iran and Syria, those between Iran and Iraq on the one hand, and also those between Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and the UAE on the other. Power after 2010, in my view, became fluid at home and also became a commodity in inter-regional relations. The uprisings also tested the limits of external power's ability to shape outcomes and minimize the fallout from the turmoil in the region. Until this point, the assumption was that external powers have almost complete dominance and control of the region. Those conspiracy theories, in my view, began to evaporate when we saw the inability of these external powers to do anything, until it came to the point where the Russians had to use force to stabilize Syria. By any measure, the Arab uprisings have proved to be the most important force reshaping the region in the post-Cold War period. Established patterns of behavior have been disrupted, and no single or group of countries from within or outside the region has successfully managed to shape the transition period. The prolongation of the region-wide crisis has dramatically increased the sense of insecurity within regional states, which itself has also strengthened the grip of internal security institutions. The region has become securitized beyond imagination. The prolongation of regime-wide crisis has dramatically increased the sense of insecurity within states, which itself has also been affecting the grip of internal security institutions. As a consequence, the region's unpredictable security dynamics, regional state behavior in terms of their own, defining their own orientation, has become harder to anticipate. In addition, the circulation of elites, that is to say the change of regimes, coupled with the growing role of citizen power in the transition countries and beyond, has threatened to change the society regime balance of power in favor of social forces. We see this in front of our very eyes in Algeria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in Sudan, in this year alone. The uprising further also posed serious challenges to wider interested parties. Such countries as Israel, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar have all adjusted their foreign policies in response to these dynamics, becoming more proactive and responsive to the rapidly changing regional landscape. But they have done so with no guarantee of success, nor indeed coordination with each other. So the messy process of transition has had a very direct and dramatic impact on power at home, who has it, and how is it wielded, as well as on the regional balance of power. The uprisings have brought regional powers in conflict and in competition with each other. Let's take a few examples to demonstrate this. So Iran and Turkey compete in Iraq, Syria, and Central Asia. Iran and Saudi Arabia compete in the Gulf, the Levant, and as flag bearers of Islam in other parts of the Muslim world as well. Iran and Israel project power into their respective hinterlands and compete at the strategic level as well. The smaller Gulf Arab countries try and pursue an independent foreign policy, but with the exception of Qatar, don't stray too far from Saudi Arabia. Policy in the transition countries, moreover, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Yemen, has been hostage to given balance of post-authoritarian political forces and the uncertainty which has accompanied the drawing up of the state's priorities. And of course, going back to the legitimizing principles driving these new policies. And finally, in Libya and Yemen, the absence of a credible central authority has continued to erode state structures and has made communal violence the norm. In both of these countries, intervention of other countries has poured more fuel on the burning fires of conflict. Furthermore, the collapse of the regimes, dominant security regimes, as they were in Egypt, in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Tunisia, in Yemen, many of these had uniformed civilians in power for a very long time before. But the collapse of these security regimes has also shuffled the pack in such a way as to enable smaller states, namely the smaller GCC countries and also Jordan, to play a substantially bigger role in preserving state structures. As noted above, at the same time, regime collapse and interstate chaos has created the permissive conditions for a range of non-state actors to compete and to operate in different and also across countries more freely and directly than they have ever done. The rise of Islamic State is a classic example of this phenomenon. The MENA region has stood out as a part of the world dominated by strongman political leaders and authoritarian regimes. For decades, autocrats have ruled over the Arab region with little regard for inclusivity, transparency in government, or the rule of law. So until the 2010s, and despite deep internal structural weaknesses, these regimes, the most masculine of which were to be found in the region's culturally and geopolitically significant Arab states, Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Syria come to mind, tended to dominate regional relations as well. Their iron grip at home often translated into assertive behavior abroad. So these outwardly powerful states assume to occupy the highest ground of the region. These countries have been, by virtue of geoculture and political influence, the fundamental links, let's call them lily pads, of Arab connectivity. As fountainheads, nodes of culture and ideas, they have historically asserted and transmitted information, knowledge, and also form. There have been diffusers of norms in the region to other states and communities. So long as the ruling regimes of these states remain strong at home and active abroad, little prospects for change seemed possible. And in the place of these states, at the top table seemed assured. They were the self-appointed guarantors of status quo, with all its shortcomings and flaws. But fierceness and interventionism prove insufficient attributes for keeping these regimes in power indefinitely. In the absence of legitimate and democratic political institutions and leadership, state institutions crumbled at the feet of their own people, and the patrimonial regimes appear to fall in the responsibility to protect their citizens and secure the sovereignty of the states. Such states as Libya, Syria, and Yemen can be seen as potentially regional failed states. States in this context have also included countries like Iraq, which is teetering on the verge of crisis. But this has meant that countries like Jordan, like Lebanon, and Tunisia also bear the fragility of this wider crisis in the region. They are the innocent bystanders which have to absorb the pressures which is coming onto them from this process of indefinite transition. Egypt, the grandest of Arab states, has diminished considerably, sadly, in the wake of its two uprisings. And the weaknesses of the Mubarak era have just amplified to make of this great nation a shadow of its former self. Egyptian weakness weakens the rest of the Arab world, in my view. But the key point for me is that the demise of what I refer to as the node states in rapid succession has plunged the region into a deep crisis. At one extreme stands Daesh, which has attempted to reorder the geography of Iraq and Syria in the interest of building a so-called caliphate. That irony of using pan-Islamism as the ideological justification for constructing a new territorial entity within two existing sovereign states should not be lost on us observers. But the real impact of the constructed Iraq and Syria is to be found in the unraveling of order in the heart of the region and the way in which this permeates beyond the borders of both Syria and Iraq. The appearance of these geopolitical potholes on the MENA landscape has destabilized what had remained of the regional system and has profoundly traumatized the people of the region and also its states. Corrosion of leadership, unfortunately, is palpable. So finally, it can be argued that the process of state failure has had three significant consequences. First, it has created vast, ungovernable spaces in which law and order has become transactional and administered by local persons, militias, or armed groups. In parts of Iraq and Syria, for example, and in virtually all of Libya and Yemen, central authority is almost absent. And armed groups with competing agendas and interests have filled this massive vacuum. In an environment of ungoverned spaces in which millions of people find themselves at the mercy of mercenaries, with a low tolerance threshold, it becomes virtually impossible to build cooperation across Arab majority spaces of the region. Such large and strategically located ungoverned spaces also provide a permissive environment for unaccountable non-state actors such as Daesh to wreak havoc on the people of the region. We see this in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Libya, but also in the case of Yemen. Secondly, the human cost of the situation has been great and should be staying on all of humanity. Let me note a report by Amal Kandil in the Middle East, from a Middle East Institute in Washington. Amal notes, to quote, MENA is now the only geopolitical region in the world where the proportion of the population that is food insecure is larger than what it was in 1990. The number of undernourished people increased between 1990 and 2019 from 16.5 million people to 52 million people. The Mashreq sub-region, MENA's most populous one, is home to more than 44 million undernourished people, who constitutes 85% of MENA's food insecure population. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Sudan have hunger rates that are among the highest in the world. We regard this region to be one of the richest in the world. Indeed, according to the IMF, to quote, Syria's 2016 GDP is estimated to be less than half of what it was in 2010. Yemen has lost an estimated 25 to 35% of its GDP in just 1 year in 2015, while Libya's GDP has fallen by 24% since 2014. Indeed, by 2018, the civil war in Syria had cost a shocking $388 billion, according to the United Nations. The cost to the Arab region as a whole is probably over $800 billion, excluding the opportunity cost of production inactivity. Societies, therefore, have been crushed under the weight of the crisis of the Arab state. As many as 35 million people have had to flee their homes between 2010 and 2016. Thirdly and finally, state failure has raised the prospects of demise of some key states as currently constituted, which has in turn invited intervention by neighbors and also outside powers. This is power play in action in real life. We've seen the consequences of this problem very clearly in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. In Iraq, Iran and Tehran-supported militias took control of vast tracts of Iraqi territory in their fight against Daesh in central Iraq, and indeed shared these ungoverned spaces with American military and its allies on the ground. Much of Iraqi territory is now the security playground of Iranian-sponsored forces. In Yemen, absence of central authority has allowed Al-Qaeda to breed, has invited military intervention by Saudi Arabia and its allies, but has also seen extensive American and other Western military intervention against real or imagined targets in that country. In Libya, Western countries are militarily active. Egypt and its Gulf allies have acquired a military presence, and Turkey and Qatar are actively involved on the other side in the power struggle of that country as well. But it's the case of Syria which is the most telling. We've seen Russian, American, British, Iranian, Turkish, and Israeli militaries in action across this country. Central authority is being challenged also in Algeria, in Lebanon, in Tunisia, and Sudan. Prospects of state collapse has magnified the sense of insecurity and has invited further secularization of interregional relations. State failure in Iraq, in Libya, Syria, and Yemen has also sucked into the mainstream this maelstrom of crisis, an array of major power interventions. In Syria, the United States and Russia compete with each other. In Libya, they ignore each other. In Syria, China and Russia stand on one side of the geopolitical scales, and the United States and its European allies on the other. And in Yemen, the United States dominates as the dominant external power. As a consequence of these competing machinations, the region remains unstable, regimes feel unsteady, and the Arab masses continue to feel exposed and vulnerable. This myriad of forces has tended to compete with each other for the spoils of failure rather than work in concert to prevent total collapse of regional order. Policy opportunism has followed, pitting neighbor against neighbor. And the lack of policy cohesion has made it almost impossible for the multilateral organizations, including the Arab League, to restore any semblance of order. Power in this geopolitical and socio-economic mess has become a very fluid commodity and therefore tradable. Like any commodity, its price is now ever-changing. It is affected by so-called market forces. That is to say, susceptible to social forces and access to it subject to sometimes arbitrary mechanisms of control. Going back to my core argument of the presentation, it should be obvious that the absence of control, we find power in this region to be in contestation. And perhaps this is to be the state of play that we're going to find ourselves in the MENA region for the foreseeable future. Allow me to end on that rather pessimistic note, and I hope that the audience can turn this argument on its head in the course of today and find much broader silver linings to this dark cloud. Thank you very much.